Welcome to the session, an inward look at the preservation field. And it's interesting, the turnout here, and we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of when we're talking about diversity, what does that mean? But let me what my job here is to set the stage. And I'm going to talk about what we are talking about, but also what we're not talking about today. So we're talking about race, ethnicity, religion, gender, language, nationality, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, generation, ability, and socioeconomic status. And if you take that one step further, we're also talking about inclusive stories, social, cultural, traditional, boundaries, authenticity, multicultural, interethnic crossover, layering, equality, understanding, listening, relevancy, voices, community, connections, representative, context, ownership, intangibles, and legacy. So what did I miss? Anything big? Hopefully I caught. Anything that is glaring omission?
Disciplines, professions.
Good. Okay, anything else?
Preservation.
Preservation. Oh, that's pretty obvious. Thank you. Thank you, Trudy. Let's see, true to her word, she's going to be the heckler. So this session is going to be different in maybe multiple ways, but definitely in two ways. One, this is going to be kind of an old-fashioned in-person crowdsourcing. So everyone's going to participate. It's not going to be a talking head session by any means. And the idea is that this kickstarts a conversation, or a conversation that's been going on, but also one that's long overdue. So this isn't going to solve the problem of diversity, and I think we've got a problem based on the audience that's here. But this is the start in this session, and maybe it continues with the next conference or on our own in different ways as we move forward. The second way in which this is going to be different is I need you all to channel your inner narcissistic aspects. And I know for some of these that will be easy. For some of you, it'll be easy. Sometimes some will be more challenging. But this is about ourself. So this is, again, an inward look of the preservation field, our movement around the idea of diversity, and how well we are doing, but also how well we may be not doing so well. That's a mix, kind of, you know what I'm talking about, in terms of that conversation. But let me throw this out to you, first of all. Who here, by show of hands, who has diversity in their mission statement, their goals, objectives, their tagline, something like that, with your organization or your group that you're affiliated with? Who, raise your hand if you have diversity mentioned in there. Okay, like 3? I'm surprised that there's not more of that. More people raising their hand that would have diversity as part of that. Let me start with more of a kind of confession on who I am. I'm Adrian Fine with the LA Conservancy. I think I know a lot of you out there. I've been working in preservation for a while at both the local, the regional, statewide, and national level, both in the Midwest, the East Coast, and now the West Coast. And I will say I'm kind of tired of just talking about diversity, because it's been a conversation that a lot of us have been having for a long time. And how do we move from talking to actually doing it? I think that's the big thing here, is how do we translate into it's a problem, it's a challenge, how do we actually do it and move it forward? And I don't think I'm alone in this perspective of feeling a little frustrated of how do we take it to the next step. And I don't think it's also much of a surprise that the preservation movement and field overall probably isn't doing so well. Some of us are making inroads and there's some really good things happening, but overall, I don't think we're there yet. And how do we get there is the big question. So I would throw it out to you as we, again, this is interactive, and as we get this going, what are 2 or 3 challenges that, from your perspective, on the reasons why we're not doing so well around the concept of diversity? This is where you interact.
engagement about doing that.
Okay, I totally agree. What's another reason? Carol?
I think there's a chicken or egg problem, right? That if someone feels like they are the only person of whatever they're identifying with in a particular group, they're uncomfortable. And so it's difficult to attract a wide variety of people until you can, it seems so at least to me, until you can get some core representation.
How about one more? Leslie?
Which end is this? The little round thing?
We think so.
Well, in my former life, I worked in a number of minority communities in Los Angeles. And there was a lot of organization in those communities. I mean, they were very organized. They were often at each other's throats, but they were organized. But what I found, even though, I'm smart and well-meaning and want to help them, there was an enormous distrust of Anglos who came into their communities, with all of the good intentions and, frankly, the money to help them. Not help them, to work with them. So it's trust.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think there's other reasons, and we're going to get into those as we kind of do the breakout groups here. But yeah, it's about who's telling the story. Are they telling it? Are we trying to tell it for them? And how well does that work? I also think it's, from our perspective, looking at this and taking an honest look at the programming that we're doing, the advocacy that we're doing, and asking ourselves honestly again and being very candid, is this moving the needle? Are we actually making a difference? And part of it goes to the standpoint of doing assessments, evaluation, and setting up kind of clear metrics and measurements in terms of what are we trying to get to and how do we get there, which not all of us have done that well. And I will just throw out 3 examples from the Conservancy just to put it out there. Some of this is kind of not therapy, but saying here's what we're doing and here's what we're trying to do better, realizing that none of us are doing this perfectly. And so I will throw out 3 examples. One, 3 programs that the Conservancy is doing, some for quite some time. One is our Last Remaining Seats program, which Trudy knows very well. It's a program that's almost 30 years in effect, and it's a program that is designed to get people into historic theaters, into downtown Los Angeles, experience a classic film, see a great space, and hopefully learn something about the Conservancy and why these places matter. And we attract around 10 to 14,000 people in around a 6-week period. And what we're asking ourselves right now at the Conservancy is this the audience that we want, or is this the audience we have? And are those the same thing? And also looking around at the audience that we've got, it's aging, it's not very diverse. And so we're going to be doing some evaluation to get a sense of, well, how do we get or expand our audience or figure out if this is even the right tool for us to engage with other types of people, younger audience, different demographics, or do we need to think elsewhere? Is this really moving the needle in terms of that particular program? So that's one area that I think is interesting along those lines. Another example I would throw out is our Modern Committee. For a lot of places, modern resources are kind of a portal. It's a place to bring in younger audience into the preservation movement. Our Modern Committee has been in place for 30 years. So we spent the last year really evaluating this program, assessing it around the idea, are we saving more places, are we engaging more people, and is this the vehicle to do that? So we're retooling that as well to kind of think broader in terms of those perspectives and trying to get more people in and different types of people. And also looking at how different groups are doing this because they are getting a different audience. And then the last example I would throw out there is our Latino initiative, which we've been at for roughly 5 years. And it takes a lot of time to build the trust, develop the relationships, and actually get projects off the ground. So we're just, I would say, at the beginning stages of there in terms of making a difference around diversity, just around that population group alone, and how do we dig deeper and expand. But I think these are some of the questions that we all need to be asking ourselves as we really take this topic seriously and again go from talking about it to actually doing something and making a critical difference, which I think is the whole goal of this session again, is how do we get that going and how do we help one another to really move that forward. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Christina, who's going to talk about how we're going to actually do that today. So thanks. Sure. Sure.
My perspective, since I've been involved in historic preservation for over 35 years and was one of the people who came in as a forward.
Absolutely.
And I've worked nationwide in historic preservation, and diversity has been a question since the very beginning. The inclusion of different groups ebbs and flows, and it's ebbing again. It's not on the rise. But what I've learned is that there are groups, there are cultural groups and ethnic groups that are doing what we call historic preservation, but we don't tap into them. It's there. They do it among their own groups, and there's, and I'm ingrained in this. There's the National Park Service standards, and in terms of what is historic, there are. It's basically a Euro-American perspective. In terms of integrity, it's a Euro-American perspective. And when I visited the Hopi Reservation and was working with, was learning about their tradition in historic preservation, it's teaching the younger people, and they don't care what the material is. It's teaching the younger people. And so it's out there, they're involved in it, they're just not involved in the mainstream historic preservation. So I think you need to recognize that it's there. We just, in the mainstream, are not, and maybe we shouldn't be the people who gather them all in.
Totally agree with everything you just said, because I think it is a big issue about the affiliated, unaffiliated, and are we looking at it from the wrong way? And also that we may be part of the problem in terms of the tools that we've been using, or the approaches that we look at preservation, like the standards alone, and issues like integrity and materials and things like that, may not be in line totally with other groups and cultures. So absolutely. So Christina?
So just to explain this little microphone, we decided that it could be, the discussions that we're having today could be valuable information for our field in general in preservation, for CPF and their advocacy efforts, and so we decided to record portions of this session, not necessarily when we're breaking out into groups, but we'll come back, which I'm about to explain, and share our thoughts. And those will be recorded. So that's why I've been walking around with a little microphone. My name is Christina Dykes. I'm an architectural historian at Page and Turnbull. What we're going to be doing throughout the rest of this session is breaking out into, I think, 3 groups. We have several facilitators here. We didn't know how many people would be showing up for this session, so we have 6 people who are part of the organizing committee for this, but we certainly all have our own thoughts that we can contribute as members of this session. Just as very brief introductions, Adrian will be one of the facilitators. We have Eric Neer, who is a structural engineer at Holmes Coley. We have Rebecca Fogel, who is an architectural historian, preservation planner for the city of Auckland in New Zealand, their Built Heritage Department. Rich Sucre, who is a preservation planner for the city of San Francisco, and Jan Woolley, who works for state parks. Did I miss anybody? There's a lot of us. So we're each going to split off to each of the groups. I think if we just kind of organize ourselves and try to get into about even number of people per group around, we could do the middle board there, and then the one up here at the front and the one at the back there, to kind of arrange ourselves in seats. And we're going to talk for about 10 minutes within the group. We have some prompting questions, and our discussions can certainly go off into whatever direction we end up taking them. And then we're all going to come back again, and representatives of the groups will share some of the thoughts that each of us came up with for about 20 minutes. And then we have another group breakout session and discussion for another 10 minutes, and then come back for 20 more minutes and discuss kind of where, what are we talking about and where do we want to go from here. We realize this is a really big topic that all of us could probably talk about for a long period of time, and we don't have much time today. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's possible that this session could lead to another one next year at the CPF conference. So we certainly invite some really some great feedback, both as part of this session and in your review forms at the end for how we can either improve upon this session or the types of topics that might be useful to discuss in another. We would really love for this to continue on. So with that, I think let's just break out into groups and we'll kind of get ourselves organized and then launch into some of these discussion questions. Thanks. So from the first group, we had, I'd say within our group, a pretty diverse selection of folks in terms of professional involvement. Several cities represented, as well as large organizations, and we had one professor representing an interesting perspective from the younger generation coming up. But one of the things that, the biggest thing we felt is that there's a difference of perspective that the traditional preservation community just really isn't tapping into. So some of the things we talked about were the perspective comes from different groups, whether they're ethnic groups or community groups or professional groups. They're coming at preservation with a much different perspective, and the language that we use is so specialized that a lot of times we can't talk to each other even though we're trying to reach a similar goal. So a lot of, and the other thing that we came up with is a lot of the folks who are in charge of the regulating process or the governmental process, which preservation as regulation and preservation as activity are two very different things. And the folks who are generally in charge of preservation as a regulatory process with the governments, those tend to be largely affluent, white, predominantly still male, although a little more gender diversity. But the folks that are coming at preservation from a community perspective are not represented by that same group, and therefore there's a lot of intimidation, perhaps difficulty communication, and not really an identification with the different folks. Again, regulation versus community outreach. And outreach was the other thing we talked about in terms of diversity, the idea of how to approach various community groups when you might not necessarily be part of the community group. And some of the efforts that have been talked about were the traditional method of just giving the information, say, before surveying and then showing up on the street and surveying, tended to be very adversarial, and rather than doing that, changing the approach so that it was more engaging, more about the place and less about the process. And finally, just going back to the language, the way that we communicate, preservationists tend to use a very specialized language, and unless you're highly ingrained with it and come at it from an academic perspective or have been doing it for a while, it's very difficult for folks who are not coming from that perspective or from that training to start to engage in the conversation or to be taken seriously.
Great. All right, this one.
Okay, I'm representing my group because I can read my own writing. So in our group, we're represented by an architectural historian consultant, a structural engineer, an employee at Caltrans who works in the cultural studies department, advocacy on the city government side of things. So somewhat diverse, but all professionals within a field that's related. We talked about who we feel is missing from our group, sitting right there. and mentioned Asian population or other minority populations. I think we're all pretty much white. Community organizers for other causes that are related or overlap, but are not tapping into preservation issues per se. Owners or developers who may only get involved when it's a tool that they can use to their benefit, or they get involved because there's a project and they're more in opposition side, reactive. We talked about various types of professions who are related to architecture, design, or preservation projects, but those people are not necessarily as represented in terms of people who are really interested in preservation as a cause. So various types of engineers who are part of projects, structural, civil, mechanical engineers. I'm sure there are a lot of other professions. Let's see. Oh, we talked about how perhaps the approach should be kind of flipped around. We're trying to bring people into organizations like CPF instead of going out and letting those people in communities lead. Going to established organizations or neighborhoods to establish partnerships. We talked about courses for real estate agents and developers, educational courses, or also kind of team building, trust building, and that could happen for real estate agents or developers or a lot of other types of groups. We discussed proactive versus reactive preservation, and that there needs to be a little bit more emphasis on proactive outreach versus reactive when there's a project that, or a threat to a historic building. And then we did talk about perception. The preservationists are seen as project stoppers. In San Francisco, this has been happening since the 1960s, so there's this definite perception, negative connotation that comes along with preservation. And the term is value-laden and potentially outdated. That we as a newer generation of preservationists should perhaps come up with another term. And as a side note, just as a member of the program committee for this conference, we even talked about, do we want to use the word preservation in the title for this conference? Do we want to use heritage, conservation? We threw around some various terms, and I don't know if any of those are, did we even?
King of the World came up.
Yeah.
No, I don't think we agreed on anything, but acknowledged that in other countries there is this change, and preservation is seen as a much older term, and it's outdated, and it relates to a demographic that we don't currently represent, or would like to expand on.
Let's see. We talked about some challenges with preservation, especially in places where there are transient populations or newer populations, and so there's less investment in an area for its built heritage that came before somebody moved to that location. So they may have values in their own community, but it might be a newer community and is less rooted in the kind of traditional preservation of buildings or appreciation of a history that came before you arrived. And again, for people who are not full-time residents, maybe more wealthy locations where people have a second or a third house and they don't live there all the time. So again, they're not as invested. And then we, at the very end of our discussion, we talked about how there are things that prevent other people from being able to participate. Maybe they even want to, but they can't because funding is an issue. It costs money to come to this conference, and so lower income community members are not able to come, and what do we do about that? So we covered a good amount of ground, but more questions than answers at this point.
Excellent. And then I am also talking on behalf of my group because they nominated me. So our group, we sort of got talking about our own group, but then that spun off into a conversation about sort of who's involved in preservation more generally. Our own group, we were 50-50 on the gender balance, but we noticed that the wider field seems to be mostly female, especially among like community volunteers and people in the community who are interested. Sort of a lot of retired older white women tend to be interested. And our group also was mostly white, plus rich. And then our group, it was pretty much all professionals, although from a variety of different sectors, variety of different employment. We had public sector people, private sector people, sort of self-employed people who work at big firms, and then also nonprofit representation. And coming from a variety of backgrounds, architectural historians, planners, archaeologists, someone with a tech and management background, so interesting mix. We noticed that a lot of the people in the wider fields in the community are not professionals. They're just folks who are interested. A lot of them might be property owners. A lot of them tend to be more affluent, middle to upper class. We also noticed that within the field, the LGBT population is well represented sort of professionally, but the story and their interests is actually one of the things that is not as well represented. So we've kind of noticed that as an interesting thing. Who's not there? Minority residents of all of our cities, particularly ethnic groups, and lower income groups. Students as well was something that was flagged as sort of a group that's missing. And also related professional disciplines. We had a lot of things that are sort of thought of as the sort of classic examples of, methods into preservation, but there's a lot of related professional fields, such as, the sustainability movement and people working in the green building industry, and, the list goes on, but people who might have related interests. Some of the obstacles, we talked a little bit about some of the perceptions, and actually that one of the obstacles to increasing diversity in preservation was that some of the people who are more diverse are people sometimes, coming from overseas or are new to the community in some way, and those people, that increase in diversity locally is actually seen as the enemy of preservation. Those are people who are coming in and making changes and stuff like that, and so there's maybe a bit of a conflict or an obstacle there. There's also this idea that preservation of a place, especially in San Francisco, we were talking that all the gentrification and the conversations around that preservation of that is stopping development, is causing the loss of affordable housing, when really it should be the opposite. And then we talked also about the way what came out in discussing our group versus the wider field was that we do sort of have two groups. We have people who are professionals who are interested and people in the community, and that there seems to be a bit of a gap in the way that information is presented. Someone else was talking about sort of the terminology that is used and the language and sort of the way that we engage with the community. Maybe there's a way that we could do that better. And that developing trust in communities, particularly some of those minority and lower income groups, that developing trust takes time, and that was talked about before as well. But when we go into the planning process for just an area plan or something like that, like we know that takes time, and you go in and you spend the time with the community, and you build up that trust. And I think that we were talking that a similar framework might be good. And then the last thing that we talked about was kind of interesting was that, and this is coming partly from the nonprofit side of things, that sort of the people with the money are sometimes different from the people with the diverse backgrounds, and that if you're trying to get people interested in your organization, particularly as a nonprofit, that it's often the people who can bring in the funds and fund your programs and that get courted first. And that maybe we should rethink sort of how we do that and more low-cost programs and things like that to really bring in the people that we want to bring in. So that's what we talked about. Oh, and I'm connected here.
How are we doing on time?
We've got 20 minutes. I'm wondering if, I'll throw it out in terms of a suggestion, is maybe, since it's a relatively small group here, the next piece of this is what do we do about this? So maybe we just do one big group and just throw out ideas in terms of strategies or things. You know, Tim, you were talking about things you're doing differently about, you know, from the city of San Francisco that, you know, kind of doing the same task but in a different way that's working better for you. But I mean, are there other ideas or things that we should throw out in terms of how do we do this better, or things that we're seeing that's working that seems to be making a difference, or other things? But I think that's, if we could have more of a conversation there again, and this again is not going to solve the problem, but let's throw out some ideas.
I think maybe for organizational purposes, if Adrian can kind of moderate this, and perhaps, and Rebecca has already, I was going to ask you, but you already volunteered. And then I'm going to come around with this microphone so that the video camera can pick up each time somebody speaks. So wait for me to kind of get to you first before you really start talking.
Who's first? Gretchen.
So tiny. So can you hear me?
It's just a microphone to the camera.
Okay. So one thing I've realized recently, I've worked in private government and nonprofit sectors before, and one thing I've realized is that whenever we talk about preservation in a project sense, it's the people who have experience with the place directly and personally that usually try to fight for it, and then some section of the professional population. And I think there needs to be a lot greater focus. I was the person that talked about proactive versus reactive advocacy, and I think it is so important that we as a field focus more of our efforts and money and time on the proactive aspects of our work, because I think unless you can help people have personal experience with a place and instill value in it to begin with, it doesn't stand a chance of ever surviving. And I think it's really important that we think about education and outreach in a broader sense, and trying to create experiences for people so that they can have that personal connection, so that they can try to push for something to be preserved, whether that be the physical fabric or the oral histories or, you know, different aspects of these places and in our history that we all share.
Great.
Just to build on that, this point was brought up earlier, that as we try to engage more diverse populations and to get a better sense of place and what is important about place, that we also have to look at look at our evaluation systems so that they're more inclusive, not just the, you know, Euro-Western values, but ideas of preservation beyond what we recognize currently.
I think it's also important to start thinking about where our agenda aligns with those of other interest groups. I mean, the whole idea that preservationists are elitists and they're coming in to gentrify a community. I mean, the Ambassador Hotel is a sterling example of that. And they were there to gentrify and wipe out affordable housing, et cetera, which is the opposite of the case. I think that needs to be defined much more clearly to make us more, you know, acceptable to other interest groups rather than the enemy which some of them think of us as.
I also think looking for partnerships outside of, at least the city that I represent doesn't have a high professional population in this area. So we've been looking at partnerships with the local library groups and with the local neighborhood groups, and really trying to diversify the method in which we're getting just, you know, storytelling out in the community, and looking for other partnerships that aren't, you know, conventional in this field.
Great. There's in the back.
One of the things I've noticed in our work, we focus a lot on the structures and buildings. There's obviously a lot of history behind the structures, and the emotive power that the stories have. I don't think we've really learned how to tap into and really share and empower. And I think that the interpretive characteristics we talk about interpretation and whatnot and have plans for the things like that, but I don't think we've really tapped into the opportunities behind the emotive power, and that drives a lot of, whether we want to move something forward or hold it back, whatever is causing people to get engaged with these issues. There's enormous power there, and I just don't think it's been looked at and really we've learned how to utilize that to both the historic resources benefit, but also to the culture in itself. So.
I think there's a tremendous untapped opportunity in schools, and working with young people, particularly one area we've identified is the lack of local curriculum to meet the requirements for understanding the community in the second and third grades. And we haven't yet been able to fund the program, but I believe that will be tremendously productive in terms of engaging not only the students but the parents in understanding the places where they live and the stories behind them.
Can I just kind of move the conversation also to the issue of kind of this issue which has come up around kind of how we brand ourselves, how we talk about our work, and sorry to put you on the spot, but I think it's interesting in terms of the Legacy Bars program. If maybe you, because I think of that, part of this is that switching from reactive to proactive, the way in which we talk, how do we be think about different things in terms of what we care about, and also connecting with what the community cares about, and that's a good example. So I'd just be curious because it is a good strategy.
Absolutely. So in case you aren't familiar with it, San Francisco Heritage last year launched a program called Legacy Bars and Restaurants, and it was in response to real threats that were facing the business community in San Francisco, like rising rents and displacement, and longtime businesses that were trying to use traditional preservation tools like landmarking to prevent being evicted from their longtime spaces. And it's an honorific program. It's purely promotional and helping these businesses brand themselves as historic. But in order to really build those relationships with the business community, we had to remove the word preservation from our outreach. And we had a lot of businesses coming back to us and saying, "Well, I don't want my property rights restricted. I don't know who San Francisco Heritage," or they had a different association with who we were. And it was only after a year of really showing that we were not going to use the word preservation really to describe what we were doing, even if we were considering it part of our expanded toolkit. We've had a lot of success, not only in sort of getting the business community to understand that their history is an important part of how they operate, but that we were meeting people where they were. So even if the larger community in San Francisco didn't really understand what preservation was, they understood the community bar or the local bar that they went to and why that place mattered, and they could rally around the idea that it might not be there if they weren't sort of proactive about patronizing it and bringing their friends there. And so it meant getting on social media and coming up with other graphics and other kinds of things that we may not, maps that we may not be part of what, as a preservation organization, we were traditionally doing, but just trying to build this younger constituency, and not just younger, but multi-generational constituency around these businesses.
Great. And my understanding that has brought in a lot of new folks that never would have affiliated with the organization previously?
I mean, just the numbers on social media. When we launched this program, we had maybe 800 followers on Facebook, and a year later we have over 3,000. So.
How did it affect your guys' membership?
It didn't affect our membership necessarily, but we have more people at events, and we have more name recognition, and we got a lot of press attention as a result of it. And we have a lot of businesses coming to us now saying that they want to be involved in the program. And I get calls every time, because we induct new businesses in rounds of 25, and we're approaching the 100 mark this summer, and we have to develop an application now to come up with a streamlined way of businesses getting involved. So I don't know if it's necessarily translated into new heritage members, but I think we have a broader constituency as a result. However,
Great. Question?
Excuse me,
I was mentioning this in our group, but one of the challenges for other groups coming to CPF is the cost. Going to the conferences, going to the workshops is incredibly expensive if you're from a low-income community or if you're from a local historical group or other interest group that doesn't have a big budget. And that's a real drawback. And I think that organizations should, especially CPF, should maybe think about letting someone else take lead and then provide the support and the backup and partnering. And I know with the California, let's see, with the Society for Commercial Archaeology, which is dedicated to recent past and roadside architecture, they partnered with a local Los Angeles group when they put on their conference and opened up their tours and things to that group and tried to keep the costs down so that everybody could come and be inclusive. And it was more successful partnering with the local group and letting them take the lead than it was for the larger organization to put it on. So I think you need to think about that as giving or allowing others to take the lead and just supporting them and keeping costs down. It's nice to come to Asilomar. It's nice to go to other big places. But the reality is the people in the communities can't afford to do this.
I think there's a question there, and while you're making your way there, can I just throw out something to think about as we get to the close of this? Is, are there things that CPF could be doing or that we as a preservation group could be doing to help move this forward? Again, there's been a lot of talk, conversation that's been going on for many years around this issue, but is it getting models or examples like what's happening in San Francisco out there more broadly and dissecting that in terms of saying, here's how they did it, here's what worked, whatever it is. But I think if we can think more about that too and throw some suggestions, that would be good to kind of end this so that we can take this somewhere. But did you have a question?
I mean, I partially wanted to build on what Laura was saying with this idea that we do need to have better models, and that basically so much of us and what we do is focused on CEQA, and really realizing that partially legacy bar came from the fact that we realized we can't really be, nominating businesses and things like that, and so it is developing these more proactive models that sort of move us away from our traditional models, and also maybe changing a little bit about how we're thinking about traditional cultural properties, which is happening right now, and having that not just be an overlay on the National Register, but getting into other models, kind of things where we're thinking about recognizing social heritage, and that's going to happen not under a National Register, a California Register model, and then that getting more proactive into also working with local communities and doing the interpretation and the honoring of these communities, and their businesses and their people in a way that really gives back to the community and invests in the community. And I think that there are models in San Francisco, but also a lot of other communities that it would be good to have CPF come back and I think focus on some of those. And then I think some of the advocacy work that CPF is doing also with, say, like state tax credits and these other models that groups are doing to kind of focus on how do we expand all of those projects, realizing that a lot of what we've done has really been building focused and National Register, California Register, and realizing that there's these other things that we can do. So I think that CPF can have that maybe as a track in San Diego.
I think also with the types of workshops that CPF provides, a lot of them are kind of 101 workshops, but they're to train or to provide an understanding to professionals and also other community members about the Secretary of the Interior standards or CEQA, or there's still the traditional evaluation methods, kind of to teach the broader community about the tools that the professionals use, but perhaps that needs to be rethought to an extent, or spin it on its head, or provide workshops that that don't only focus on the professional standards, but also focus on other types of heritage gathering practices or other things.
Yeah, well, I just speaking since I in CPF. You know, I think that that's actually one of the strengths that we have is the networking part, is the fact that we can reach a statewide audience. You know, ultimately, you know, we still rely on a lot of the local groups to do a lot of the the day-to-day, and a lot of what I notice is it's always down to one or two people, you know, especially when you have these sites that are not often recognized. Like I think about the handball court that the Conservancy walked through. You know, how did that program really get off the ground, and how did it gain the successes that it did? And are the people still engaged with the Conservancy and with the group subsequently, you know, to the handball courts being saved? But ultimately, it's probably driven by like one or two like very strong-minded people that are passionate about a place and that want to make sure that they can find, you know, some kind of voice. You know, CPF it can help facilitate that, but they're not the one that's going to be down on the you know, in the ground in the community, you know, laying themselves across the bulldozer for that place. You know, they're going to help basically share it to everyone else that yes, this is a great story. This is something that everyone should understand, and this is also something that you also need to recognize that there's other types of places and people out there that are running into these kind of situations. So,
great point. So we're down to like the last 4 minutes. So I know Chris and Leslie, questions. Chris, do you still have a question or thoughts?
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said about the training. I noticed in serving on a preservation commission, one of the things that really, and I'm not saying this is California, I'm not going to say where this was, but I was kind of mortified at the way that the people who were on the commission dealt with the public, and I felt like that, I spent most of my time kind of trying to help the other commissioners understand how we can be better communicators, and I think maybe that might be a kind of training that would be really helpful, is just those basic people skills, those interaction skills, how to be a better communicator with the people that you're trying to reach, because that seemed like something that was definitely missing in the commissions that I was dealing with, and they would just sort of come at it from a very strict standpoint of this is what we are here to do, and we don't really care about your issues, we're just looking at these few things and all the other stuff is irrelevant to us, and that was incredibly off-putting. So figuring out how we can help some of the people who are on the front lines do a better job of being sensitive to some of those other issues beyond what's sort of thought to be our purview, I think could be helpful.
Is there another?
I mean, this may have been mentioned by someone else, but I think CPF could fill a really important role in sharing best practices, and they may already do that. But I know the LA Conservancy is doing a lot in the Westlake area and Pico Union with OLA, and the San Francisco program sounds really interesting. And if there a way that CPF could somehow facilitate the sharing of that program information, and then maybe at some point in time translating preservation into English and then English into Spanish.
I like the idea. Translating preservation into English is really valuable.
It's interesting, you know, like working from a city perspective, it is one of those things that actually is very relevant. Like having translation services is the only way you can reach certain sectors of the population. You know, and I actually had no concept of this until I started working for a city, that there's still people out there that don't speak very good English. So how are they supposed to understand, you know, that their place is important, or that a site that they have, you know, nearby them is important when there's a physical language barrier?
So unless there's one last burning thought. Oh, yeah.
Our dutiful, well, I was just thinking about sort of in hearing some of the stuff that, you know, CPF could do, and thinking about sort of Adrian's question to the audience at the beginning of, you know, who has that a mission statement, or, you know, some sort of statement about diversity. And if there's a way that an organization like CPF, you know, could sort of make some kind of statement like that, that then other groups could adopt and say, you know, our organization sort of subscribes to this sort of new direction and new party line, and that would be an easy way to sort of, so that there's so many different organizations, and that's what's great about, you know, CPF can reach that statewide audience and share these ideas, and, you know, it seems to me that maybe something like that, you know, they could take a stronger stand on that and say, this is what we want preservation in California to include, and then people could, say.
As a role model?
As a role model and sort of leading by example, that then some of the other organizations could say, we subscribe to this sort of higher standard and we're striving to sort of meet that CPF goal or model or, whatever form it takes. But that was just my thought. Thanks.
All good thoughts. We're out of our time, but I just wanted to, we wanted this to be a different session than your typical session, much more interactive, getting actual thoughts and feedback out there in terms of actual suggestions of what we can actually be doing. So hopefully we can figure out what to do with this. Lots of good information here. Again, start of a conversation, but I want to thank the folks that organized this session, Christina, Rich, Rebecca, Eric, Jan, right? And because they really did want to do something different and have a conversation here that needs to continue. So think about how we can do that. But thanks everyone.
And please, if you can, on your review forms, provide constructive feedback about, if we were to continue this conversation in a session next year, perhaps of the same or a similar format, how would you like to see that happen? What should the topic include?
It could be a session, a symposium, a webinar. One of the things that we do very easily recently is it's not as labor intensive to put on a webinar if you think that's the reach that can happen.
And if you want to give all 5s on the evaluation, that's fine. We have no problem with that.